Okay, let's continue in chapter 3. Now, Paul is going to try to prove to the Galatians that his gospel is true. And now he's going to talk a little bit about Abraham. So let's give you some background on Abraham so we can understand the rest of Galatians chapter 3. First of all, God gave this incredible invitation to this man named Abram back in Genesis 12. He said to Abram, "Go from your country. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. All the families on earth shall be blessed through you." And we see a few chapters later in Genesis 15 that this guy Abraham struggles to believe this promise. And the reason is because he doesn't have any kids. He says, "Oh Lord, what will you give me? For I continue to be childless." And so he's basically saying all these promises you gave me in chapter 12, none of these can be true because I don't have any kids and I'm an old guy now. And then God said this to him. He said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you can." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." So he makes this incredible claim, God does, to Abraham. He says, "Oh, you're going to have kids. Don't worry about it. You're going to have more kids than you even know what to do with." And look what it says in verse 6. It says, "And Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted it to Abraham as righteousness." Now, we'll get back to verse 6 in a minute here. But first, let's continue one more thing in Genesis on the background of Abraham. We see the sign of the covenant. So God makes this great promise to Abram, and then he says this. He says, "You're going to keep my covenant, and here's what you need. Here's going to be the sign of the covenant. Here's your part in the covenant." He says, "Every male among you shall be circumcised." In fact, it clarifies in verse 13. He says, "Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised." Now, this is exactly what the Judaizers are emphasizing to the Galatians. They're saying to the Galatians, "See, look, this is what God told Abraham in Genesis 17. So you Gentiles who are born basically outside of the house of Abraham because they weren't Jews," says, "You Gentiles have to be circumcised if you want to be children of the promise. You have to be circumcised if you want to really be favored by God." But here's Paul's take, and this is what he's saying in this whole thing, not just in Galatians, but in other letters that he writes in the New Testament. Paul's saying this in verse 6, Galatians 3:6. He says, "Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness." See where he's getting that from? Genesis 15. And so basically what Paul is saying is the defining moment for Abraham was chapter 15, not chapter 17. The Judaizers want you to think it's all about circumcision, but really it's about believing in God. In fact, he goes on and he says this, "Faith makes you a son of Abraham, not circumcision." This was important for Gentiles to hear. This is incredible, really, that Paul would even say this, because remember, Paul used to be a Pharisee, so he used to be on the side even further than the Judaizers before he believed in Jesus. But now look what he says in Galatians 3, verse 7. He says, "Knowing then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham, the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, not by works, he preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham." And so basically what Paul is saying is these verses we just looked at, God, who knew that Jesus would come and die on the cross, he knew that all the Gentiles, not just Jews, would be justified by faith, not by works. He says all of this was his plan all along, and we see it in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. And so he says, "So then those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith." Now, as a group, why don't you hit pause and talk a little bit about that? Maybe go back to Genesis if you have time. Go back to and read some of those passages in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, and maybe answer this question before you move on to the next video, and we'll see you in that next video.